Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Skidmore's Giving Day. We are over a third of the way toward our goal of 750 donors. Thank you so much for everyone who has participated thus far. I'm so excited to welcome Ron Seyb, Associate Professor of Government here at Skidmore. Ron teaches courses on American presidency, the United States Congress, political psychology, and media and politics. His research interests include presidential management of the executive branch, political oratory, and the developmental trajectory of political journalism. It's a mouthful.
It's a tongue twister. I'm a challenge.
Ron has published articles on Nixon, Carter, and Reagan presidencies, and on Pat Brown's governorship of California and Presidential Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Policy History, and California Politics and Policy.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming.
No, thanks for inviting me. This is exciting. Yeah.
So I want to let everyone know that Ron will be taking questions. So if you'd like to ask him something, please go to #SkidmoreForLife, or you can also click on that chat button to submit your question. And Ron is here to share with us how Skidmore students engage with the political process on campus.
Yeah, I think it was a pretty successful year, I think, in terms of getting our students. And our students, we didn't really have to nudge them. They were, generally speaking, pretty invested in the political process. One thing that happened, I think many of you may be aware of, is that the Tang Museum ran a series of events around an exhibit called A More Perfect Nation, which was a really interesting exhibit. It was an artist had gone around the country and had asked people, or found American flags that were a little tattered or frayed, and asked if they wanted to change that tattered or frayed flag for a new flag, and he got the tattered flags and hung them up in one of the main galleries in the Tang Museum, and that became kind of an event space. We brought in speakers, there were panel discussions, and I think the attendance in those events was outstanding. Well, 100, 200 people almost every time we had an event there. We also had a number, I speak just about, I'm very sectarian, I'll talk about the political science department a little bit. One of my colleagues, Christopher Mann, was involved in a nationwide research project to do some observations of polling places to see if they follow best practices or not. So he had 30 students who went to polling places all around not only Saratoga County, but the capital region, and did some observational research there, which was very exciting for them. I think they're now sort of sifting through the data and gonna have some conclusions to present a report. Chris also had his students in his campaigns and elections class volunteer in a state legislative race or a state senate race, Democratic and Republican, making sure that it was completely bipartisan. So they got some real kind of hands-on campaign experience as well. We of course also had the Young Democratic Club and the Republican Club doing voter registration drives too, which is what they normally do to raise awareness and just get more a participatory culture. So it was a pretty vibrant campus before the election. And I think the presidential campaign obviously was a focusing kind of event, but they also had a lot of interest, I think, in some of the House races, Senate races, and state legislative races too, which were fairly competitive around here.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So can you tell us, a little bit about the vibe at the events and, a little bit more about the speakers that came?
Yeah, we had, one speaker was a really interesting gentleman. He is actually undocumented. He's a journalist. I think his last name, I wish I had his first name, but his name was Vargas. He's an undocumented activist who came to speak about questions of immigration and migration. He had an interesting personal story. He was able to connect it obviously to larger issues in the culture, larger political issues as well, and I think had a very good response to that. As I said, it was very personal, so at some points it was very kind of emotional, but very analytical too. So I know it's a nice balance between those two things. We also had debate watching parties there, which featured some of my colleagues doing sort of post-debate analysis, so of all the presidential debates and the vice presidential debate as well. So we had that going on too, which again drew immense crowds. I was quite surprised. I think students wanted to kind of get together and watch the debates in a more kind of communal atmosphere and exchange views. And I think it was pretty exciting to see that. And I know debates are oftentimes seen as sort of in many ways not very useful. We some Americans thought, but I think our students learned a lot from them. So that was going on too. Environmental studies program had its keynote address there as well. So Menita Sanvi in the management and business department did a really interesting talk on gender in presidential elections, because that's really her forte, which was, again, very well attended and generated a lot of student interest. So I could sort of see kind of the ripple effects from those events in my classroom, where students were going to the events. We didn't have to really compel them too much, maybe nudge a few of them, but most of them went there voluntarily, which is always great. So I think it was really good in the sense that we had events that were both kind of, again, I think, sort of pivoting around the elections, but also touched into larger kind of, I said, political, cultural, social questions that we're addressing in the classroom and outside the classroom. Yeah.
That's very fascinating. So what do you think, I mean, as this was all being sort of put together, what was the hope and for the takeaway for the students to participate?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had pretty modest expectations. Students have very busy lives, and we're probably responsible for that because we demand a lot from them in the classroom. So we thought if we could kind of get, again, 50, 75 students to an event, that's a fantastic number. But again, it exceeded all expectations. So I think we're all kind of, in many ways, both, impressed, surprised, and exhilarated by it. So yeah, and I think there was a lot of talk about the fact that the presidential campaign in particular was not going to energize students because of Bernie Sanders' failure to win the nomination, some of the feelings that students had about Donald Trump. But I actually found the opposite to a certain degree. I thought students were very engaged. I've been here, and I'm loath to say this, but I've been here for almost 30 years now, because it makes me very vintage, but not in a wine sense. And I think in terms of the presidential elections I've experienced, other than Barack Obama's campaign in 2008, which I think was anomalous in a lot of different ways, and was very special, I don't recall seeing students as energized and engaged as they were, particularly in this cycle. Yeah. And
were there any sort of post-election? Was there a wrap-up kind of an event?
We're gonna do something. We have not done it yet. One of the issues was we came up against Thanksgiving, so we wanted to do it in the right way, and we want to do it in a way that's kind of data-driven and talk about sort of what happened and why it happened, what's the future. So one idea in the political science department we're talking about is maybe bringing some alums in. Some alums who either worked in the campaign or may have worked. We actually have one alum, for example, who was a special assistant to John Kerry in the State Department. So we thought it might be interesting to bring her in to talk about the future of America's relations in the world. So we're thinking about that and have, again, a kind of a bipartisan panel of alums. Our students hear us a lot, and not that we're not enchanting and fascinating in so many different ways, but I think it's also very interesting for them to hear from alums who have been out there working in practical politics and really have a lot of wisdom to share. So that's kind of our thought. We're thinking maybe doing it in January, around the inauguration, so that we can both do kind of a look back and a look forward at the same time. So yeah, so the planning is going on. It's just it's just right up against the Thanksgiving break was kind of a hard wall that we've been able to overcome. Yeah.
Sure. So for the events leading up to the election and for this post-event that you're organizing, do you bring students into that to participate, to help organize and put it together?
Yeah, we do try as much as possible to mind, the ideas and the thoughts of our students, because we do feel like we want, there's nothing more disappointing than constructing a very elaborate, very ornate event that nobody comes to because we're just sort of missing the mark with the students. So yeah, we do try to keep the communication lines open with our majors in particular and of other students on campus as well. And I will say, I think this is pertinent, my colleague Sarah Sweeney in the art department has put together what's called a pop-up course that she's running every Monday night between 6 and 8 p.m., which I think has 28 students in it, around the election. And it's called What's Next? What do we do now kind of thing. And so that's been, I've been sort of connected in that in a tangential way, but that's been pretty interesting. And I think the students there come from a wide variety of disciplines. We have students there not only from political science, but we have students there from biology and art and places like that, which you wouldn't expect necessarily to see that kind of engagement. I think a lot of students want to know, again, what happened, why did Trump win, and what does the future hold for American politics, and I would say the American polity. So I think that's been a really interesting innovation, and that course is part of something called the Idea Lab, which we're trying to get off, which we want to have more of these kind of pop-up courses, which are in response to events, response to new issues emerging, so that we can be a little bit more nimble, run sort of 6-week courses that will earn students a credit hour. And also, I think you can have that, really kind of buoyancy that comes from interacting with students outside of your major, right? Finding students that you don't oftentimes get to take classes with such a diverse range of students. So I think what Sarah's doing in that class is fantastic. they're all doing individualized projects, and I can't wait to see what emerges from that.
Yes, that's great.
Yeah.
And we actually have a viewer question.
Oh,
So,
oh my gosh, okay. First time, long time, I'm sure.
How do you talk about politics in your classes given the unique nature of this particular election?
Well, that's a really good question, and I will be honest about this. It's a bit of a struggle, and I'll just give one course that I teach every fall. I teach a course on the U.S. presidency, and every year I have a campaign simulation. So in off years, we usually do a historic campaign. So I've done actually even the 1912 campaign, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft, and Eugene Debs, just because I think it's helpful for students to understand what the politics was then and what the kind of constraints were then. This time I had some reservations about doing the Trump campaign, and I will be honest with that, but I went forward with it. In fact, frankly, the students were quite with it. I had a student who played Trump and did a really good job with it. I think he's actually probably going to win the election in the class. So it's been very successful in that sense. So I think some of my apprehensions about going that direction were not founded at all. The students were really good about it. I do think, again, I always am very, very mindful that, you know, I need to be, in some ways, the devil's advocate in courses. I try as scrupulously as I can not to reveal my own political views, my own political biases, because they do exist. But I think you have to be just sort of very vigilant about that. I'm always careful if I feel like, you know, the conversation is going in a certain direction. In this campaign season, you know, the direction of sort of, again, a little bit more enthusiastic support for Hillary to bring up the other side. But it is always a balancing point, because I also understand that, you know, sometimes some arguments are better than other arguments. I want to expose them to both sides, but I also want them to think about which arguments are most persuasive to them and make sure, as I said, it's evidence-based. I'm always happy to listen to any arguments, but they have to be arguments that are based on evidence, based on logic. And so I oftentimes say to students, just make an argument to me. And I do want students to take risk, and even when it comes to kind of charged issues, to take risk and make an argument that they might think is unorthodox or might think that I'm not receptive to, because if you can make a compelling case, I think that's, you know, part of being a liberally educated person, is being able to make the arguments in a way that's actually analytical and evidence-based. So yeah, but it's been a little bit more a struggle, just because I think you're right to point out that, again, given my history of presidential campaigns, this is a bit of a aberration. I think just in terms of, you know, kind of, and I'll use the language here, the coarseness of the dialogue, you know, the use of social media in a way that has made it a much less, I would say, kind of choreographed campaign. And maybe there's something good about that it wasn't quite as an orchestrated campaign that I'm used to, that with Donald Trump in particular, he's putting things on social media, which are not being vetted by his aides and not being in some ways chewed over. But that was, again, you know, a lot of the things that I think a lot of the language and a lot of the kind of accusations that were made were disturbing and troubling. But we tried to always kind of bore down, you know, a little bit, not to neglect what was happening in terms of the atmospherics or the rhetoric of the campaign, to bore down as much as we could to what was really driving these statements and what the underlying issues were, the underlying concerns, particularly of, you know, the Trump voters. We talked a lot, we're still talking about the so-called Trump movement. You know, why are people supporting Donald Trump? And there's no single answer to that. There are a lot of different reasons why people support Donald Trump, and it's not just kind of the right rural working class vote. There are many college educated people who support Donald Trump. There are many of my neighbors who support Donald Trump. I also want my students to be mindful that we live in a community here, that it extends beyond the classroom, and that there are people on campus who may not share their political views and may not share their preferences for candidates, and they always have to be respectful of others, that people have reasons for why they make the choices they do, and sometimes it's worthwhile listening to those reasons and trying to understand why they made those choices and trying to empathize as best you can. So I do want them to sort of understand that we are in a larger community here, and that, you know, there are people around them who, you know, may have very different views than they have, and that's part of being, you know, that's part of being in an intellectual environment, right? You want to be able to sort of exchange different views. You want to have diversity in a lot of different ways. So that's a very long-winded answer to a very crisp question. So I apologize for that. But I think you can see, you know, because I am, again, I still a struggle, right? It's always a balancing thing for me, is, you know, how much do I want to engage with everything that's happening out in the political environment? How much can I actually tie into the coursework too? Because I don't want this to be too much dealing with non sequiturs. If I can't tie it in, I'm going to be very reluctant to bring it in. But I also want students to feel comfortable, raising kinds of questions or issues that they've gleaned from the New York Times or gleaned from their other exposure to the media, and bringing them in and talking about how will political scientists answer that question or respond to that issue.
Great.
Okay.
We actually have another question from a viewer.
Okay.
Will there be changes in the Electoral College after this election?
Yeah, and that I was, again, because of, as I mentioned before, because of my ancient nature, I was certainly here in 2000, which I think was the last time that there was really serious discussion about Electoral College reform. And for the younger viewers out there, the millennials, it was the case that was an election in which the popular vote winner, Al Gore, did not win the Electoral College and therefore did not win the presidency. This is, again, I think what you see, Electoral College reform movements have always been there. Some viewers may understand there's something called the National Popular Vote Initiative, which is an effort to get enough states who would actually reach 270 Electoral College votes to agree that regardless of the vote in their state, that they would give all their Electoral College votes to the popular vote winner. So there's 16 states right now who've agreed to that compact. I think they're up to 170 Electoral College votes. They need to get 270 for that to work. So that's one way to do it, is kind of state by state. But again, certainly among the students, I've been hearing a lot of questions about this. I always caution a little bit for a couple reasons. One reason is simply we're talking about, right now, obviously, we're having recounts that are being pushed by Jill Stein in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. I think those recounts are probably, enterprises that the Clinton campaign's a little bit lukewarm about, because as you probably read, there's never been, a margin as large as Donald Trump had in those states has never been overcome through a recount. But one thing you have to think about is if we had a direct popular vote, if that's the alternative to the Electoral College, then you could actually have recounts in 50 states, right? If you're looking for votes just to get over that 2 million, to close that 2 million gap, it's possible to have recounts everywhere. And that was one of the things that was illustrated, I think, by 2000, where we had the recounts in Florida. And that was, so you kind of localize, in that case, the sort of legal project. But if it's a popular vote and therefore votes everywhere are counting or weighted the same, then in principle, any campaign that loses in the popular vote would ask for recounts across the country. And that could really create a problem, I think, in terms of the peaceful transfer of power. The other element of the Electoral College I always do emphasize to my students is that it does actually give representation to a lot of underrepresented groups. Latinos, for example, and Latinas are concentrated in a small number of states, right? Particularly New Mexico, Arizona, states in, again, the Rocky Mountain West, for example, Texas. The Electoral College magnifies their influence, because if you just went to a direct popular vote, a calculation could be made by a candidate that I really don't need to appeal to the Latino vote. I don't need to appeal to the Asian American vote, which is concentrated primarily in the Pacific Northwest. I don't need to appeal to the African American vote. If I can appeal to the white vote, which is still the majority of the nation, then I can win the popular vote. So I do think the Electoral College, there's been a lot of talk about how the Electoral College skews to advantage rural voters, and that's, I think, indisputable. But it also advantages some of these other kind of traditionally Democratic voting blocks too, because they are localized. They're not spread evenly across the nation. So I think I always try to remind students that the Electoral College does have some virtues. When you have this Electoral College misfire, obviously the students aren't as receptive to that, but I do want to point out that in some ways the Electoral College does work to the advantage of some of the groups that they might align with too. But again, get to the practical question, yeah, I think this is a moment where it could happen. I think, though, if we look at the past as prelude, and I remember 2000, these sorts of movements are very kind of time constrained. If nothing happens within 6 months to a year, it's likely that things are probably going to atrophy, because people lose interest in what's called a procedure reform pretty quickly. Right now it has some life and has some blood to it, because we can see Hillary Clinton as the candidate who lost because of the Electoral College. But in a year out, we'll be invested in the Trump presidency. We'll be thinking about 2020. Sort of procedural kinds of reforms don't usually have this same sort of traction with the public. So I think if it's going to happen, it has to happen relatively quickly.
Great. Another question from the audience.
Okay.
Do you have insight on the possibility of invoking a constitutional convention?
Oh, that's interesting. That is something that, again, you're getting to a real kind of government 101 question there about the Constitutional Convention. For those of you who don't know, probably a lot of viewers are familiar with the amendment process, which is typically in the Constitution. But the Constitution also holds that a constitutional convention can be called. And this is where I'm going to show my own lack of knowledge, not lack of knowledge, of course, because I'm very knowledgeable, but a lack of attention to that particular part of the Constitution. I think I forget there's a certain threshold in the House and the Senate that has to be reached in order to call a constitutional convention, and maybe state legislatures too. But that's a possibility if we do want to, again, take another look at the Constitution. So we do have embedded in the Constitution a kind of self-destruct clause so that people decide that's true. I think it's probably unlikely, and I say that primarily because I think there is so much kind of bipartisan reverence for the Constitution. I think it's a very different thing to say we want to look at the entire document, that is, the bicameral legislature, executive power, the Supreme Court's power, judicial review, to look at all those things and take a fresh look at them, versus sort of looking at one element of the Constitution that we think is atavistic or think is problematic right now. Because I do think that it is the case that we're in a country that we do, for most Americans, not all Americans, believe that the Constitution is in many ways a kind of beau ideal of a document to create a political system and institutional arrangements. And the Constitution also includes, of course, the Bill of Rights. That was not part of the original document. It was added on in the first Congress, but we think about those rights, those liberties as being sacred too. So I think that's a pretty radical proposal. I'm sure that there's always been people inclined to do that. There are people who are not constitutional evangelicals like a lot of Americans, but I do think that there really is strong sentiment. And and you hear this a lot in the rhetoric between the two parties. Certainly the Republican Party is very, very uber constitutionalist, but even Democrats and progressives talk about certainly the Bill of Rights and talk about the kind of checks and balances systems and the limits on, in this case, talking about the limits, particularly for progressive, on executive power that are in the Constitution through Congress and the courts and through federalism. So I think it's probably unlikely, again, simply because that seems like probably too radical solution to a very discrete and very narrow problem, I think, in the minds of most Americans.
So we've got a few more minutes left.
Oh.
One of the questions I wanted to ask is, when we were talking about the Electoral College, you had mentioned that was a question that it was, came up a lot with students.
Yeah.
What were some other common questions that came from the students?
Well,
as a result of the
election?
I
think a lot of it was really they came from a place of both curiosity and maybe insecurity. So questions about, would a woman's reproductive rights be protected under a Trump presidency? Could he do anything? Could he use executive power? And I had to explain that that's not really within the executive's purview, for example. So a lot of it was, and also I got a lot of questions about the filibuster. Because certainly at this point, when it comes to Supreme Court nominees, but also when it comes to legislative initiatives from the Trump presidency, what role does the Senate have? What is the filibuster? How can the filibuster be used? There was recently filibuster reform, and a lot of students don't have a real good purchase on that. So how can the filibuster be used? When can the filibuster be used? So there was actually questions not only on a policy gradient, but questions again, which I think were really interesting kind of institutional questions. Sort of, what is the role of Congress? And what, again, I think to really put a very sharp point on it, what can Trump do and what can Trump not do? What can Trump do, for example, to rescind or repeal environmental regulations, where there are things that he can do, but there are things he cannot do as well. Congress has a lot of control and a lot of power over that. So a lot of this had to do, I think, and this is where I think is the genesis of Sarah Sweeney's course, about sort of trying to give students a sense of, both sort of, again, what are the institutional checks on a Trump presidency, but what are sort of the opportunities there too? And what's the role of Congress and what's the role of courts? And frankly, what's the role of states and localities too? Because we're in a federal system, and a lot of governing in this country is not done at the federal level. A lot of governing is done at the state level. So, and I will say this just because it's a little self-indulgent, but my mother, who is a public school teacher, was very concerned about what Trump was going to do vis-a-vis vouchers or choice in schools. And I had to tell her, like, there are things he can do, but a lot of public education, both the funding and administration, takes place at the state and local level. There's not a huge amount of federal dollars that they can use to transfer into a voucher program. And there's a really good article in the New York Times that center on this. She still I did not allay her concerns at all, because she does not respect my credentials as a political scientist. She had hoped that I'd become a lumberjack or, you know, a mechanic or an engineer, something useful. But I did try to say, as a political scientist, Mom, you know, you don't have to worry about, you know, the public school system being eliminated by Donald Trump or being in some ways gutted by Donald Trump. There are limits, because we do have, sometimes it's frustrating and infuriating, but sometimes it's quite marvelous, this federal system that allows for local and state control of some pretty important functions in this country. Yeah.
Well, Ron, we are kind of closing at the end of our time.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you so much for.
Okay, you mean we can't
Yeah.
ask the affiliates to stay a little bit longer? That's not possible. I mean, Stephen Colbert does that all the time. We're running a little long. Can't you just alert your affiliates? Okay. Well, goodbye. Thank you so much for the questions, which were fantastic. I'll bring them back to my class, and for listening. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, no,
We
my
really
pleasure.
enjoyed having you.
Oh, it's great. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.